Well, as I've mentioned a few times already, this is an interesting passage in that there's a lot of geographical locations mentioned, especially towards the end of it. The beginning of it is almost just an aside, but it ends up being quite important. And then in the middle is this story about Eutychus, which is famous or infamous, depending on whether you fall asleep in church services. So we'll get to that in just a moment. But just to remind ourselves that prior to this, we had this riot in Ephesus. And Paul was intent on finishing this third missionary journey so that he could go out again on a mission to Rome, eventually to Caesar himself. He didn't want to get to Spain eventually. He mentions that in another passage. But he certainly had it as a point to get to Rome and eventually to Caesar himself. But before going back to Jerusalem to report to the church leaders there, Paul wanted to go back to Macedonia and visit the churches which had been planted there, like Thessalonica and Philippi. Now, all of this, maps, you guys like maps, right? Give me 1 second. I'll pull that up for you. All right. Can you guys see that in the back too? All right. This is the complicated one, which has all of the different passages and potential places he went to. Notice he starts out there in Antioch. But we'll use, this is a much more simplified one as well. A lot of this sermon prep, I was looking at maps, so now you get to enjoy that with me. But he is currently in Ephesus, and Ephesus is right here. And remember, all of this is modern-day Turkey, but it was considered the Asian province of the Roman Empire. And in his second missionary journey, he had gone to these churches here, and this was called Macedonia, up here in the north, and then this area actually was considered Achaia. But all of this is modern-day Greece. So we're a little bit situated. There's Italy, and there's Rome right there. So kind of sort of situated on a map. So in Paul's third missionary journey here, he says, I want to go back to Jerusalem, but first I want to go through Macedonia and through Achaia, which is this route right here, to Corinth. And in particular, Paul had a concern with the church in Corinth. I won't preach through the whole letter of 1 Corinthians, but most commentators believe that Paul wrote the letter of 1 Corinthians in Ephesus. Titus had been sent there by Paul, and either Titus or someone else had sent word to Paul about the condition of the church in Corinth. And if you remember the book of 1 Corinthians, the whole letter is a response to the different struggles and challenges that the church was facing. What kind of challenges? Remember the divisiveness, the lawsuits, a man having an inappropriate relationship with his stepmother, issue of head coverings, marriage, singleness, communion, spiritual gifts, orderliness in worship, on and on and on. In other words, the Corinthian church was pretty messed up. And we are blessed with the letter of 1 Corinthians to have that written down for us in Scripture so that we can see, well, maybe you think ICC is a little bit screwed up, but it's not quite as bad as the Corinthian church. Or maybe you think it is as bad as the Corinthian church. But I appreciate that we have these epistles which so often are addressing the things that were plaguing them at that time. And honestly, there's always drama, and there's always things that are happening in churches. So part of Paul's itinerary was shaped by his concern for the Corinthian church. If you look at 1 Corinthians 16, 5 through 9. 1 Corinthians 16, 5 through 9. This is the ending of the letter. So again, he's probably writing this from Ephesus at around the time that we're reading here in Acts 20. Paul says, 1 Corinthians 16, 5, I will visit after passing through Macedonia, for I intend to, again, that's this more northern part of what's modern-day Greece, For I intend to pass through Macedonia, and perhaps I will stay with you and spend the winter so that you may help me on my journey wherever I go. For I do not want to see you now just in passing. I hope to spend some time with you if the Lord permits. But I will stay in Ephesus until Pentecost, for a wide door for effective work is open to me, and there are many adversaries. So Corinth, I should point out, is right there. So this is likely happening around, Paul spent quite a bit of time in Ephesus, somewhere around this Acts 19:20-ish time frame. Now, if you're curious, the book of 2 Corinthians was written just before Paul got to Corinth, somewhere probably in Macedonia, and it references a severe letter that he had written, and most commentators think there was a letter between 1 and 2 Corinthians that was not recorded in Scripture. So maybe it just said, "What are you guys doing? What's wrong with you?" And that was it. And severe, get it together. We don't have it. But 2 Corinthians is written, and it's commendatory. I sent that severe letter to you, and you responded. You heard it, and you've repented, and you've turned around, and 2 Corinthians is definitely a different flavor than 1 Corinthians when you read it. And it was likely sent ahead of him just before he got into Corinth there as he traveled through Macedonia. So in other words, Paul was really worried about the Corinthians. So this is one thing that shaped his itinerary. Paul wanted to get back to Jerusalem, give his report, head back out to Rome. But on his heart was this concern for the Corinthian church. I can't just leave them hanging. I'm hearing all these troubles that are going on. So Paul allowed his itinerary to be shaped by his worry about the Corinthians and not just his own agenda and what he wanted to do. I think there's some lessons there, of course, just on our own itinerary and planning. Does it accommodate? Does your week accommodate the concerns and cares of others? Now, if you're a parent, I suppose that comes quite easily, but maybe not just your own kids. Maybe other people's kids, maybe their parents. Does your itinerary include those whom you're worried about, not just in prayer, but perhaps in some helpful act of presence? I always thought it was annoying when I was younger that my mom would always drag me to visits that she was having with her friends. I only found out much later that oftentimes she was visiting people that needed some encouragement or attention. I didn't know that. They didn't include me in their discussions, all in Korean anyway. But as the only child, I'd just have to sit there for hours trying to figure out a way to entertain myself. So maybe if you are planning in your itinerary to help someone, if you do have kids, maybe make a plan for them too. Because I was bored out of my mind so many times. This is dumb, but I would, if they had a 2-story house, I would just tumble down the stairs, go back up, and just tumble down the stairs over and over again. That explains a lot, probably. Okay. That's a random story that just came up in my head, by the way. That was not in my notes. All right. Another reason that Paul had his itinerary shaped, or another aspect of his itinerary, was that this was about encouragement and edification. Not just for the Corinthians, but for the whole of the churches in Macedonia. Almost certainly he wanted to go, and it says that he'd given them much encouragement. But most likely, it doesn't say explicitly here, Paul went to Troas right here, because that's a typical launching off point from Asia into Europe, which is represented by Macedonia here. And he had hoped to link up with Titus there, but he went into Macedonia without him. You can go to 2 Corinthians 2:12 and 13. But Paul, when he crossed over, wanted to link up with Titus. But he wasn't there, so they did eventually link up in Philippi if you're worried about Titus. While Paul only spent 3 months in Macedonia, it was a rich time. Most, again, commentators believe that the most significant New Testament epistle is the book of Romans. In terms of theology, I mean, you can't necessarily rank them per se. They're all good. But the book of Romans in particular has such rich theology. It's very intense in a way. And it's most likely that Romans was written during this time. So Romans 15:22 through 24 references the writing of the book. In Romans 15:22, it says, "This is the reason why I have so often been hindered from coming to you, because I had such rich gospel opportunities. But now, since I no longer have any room for work in these regions, and since I have longed for many years to come to you, I hope to see you in passing as I go to Spain and to be helped on my journey there by you, once I have enjoyed your company for a while. At present, however, I'm going to Jerusalem, bringing aid to the saints, for Macedonia and Achaia have been pleased to make some contribution for the poor among the saints in Jerusalem." We'll get to that in a second, that he's taking up a collection. But he's referencing his time in Macedonia and Achaia, and that's this time that we're talking about in Acts 20. And so he must have written this book around that time, the book of, or the letter of Romans. So I think in terms of itinerary, he was cognizant of his ability to bring encouragement and edification, not only to that region, but even in a sense to the whole church, a church that wasn't right there. The church in Rome was on the Italian peninsula. But here, us, 2,000 years later, Paul had the opportunity in his itinerary to write a letter that would be so profound to the shaping of our understanding of the gospel and who God is. Now, there is a last reason. So we have his itinerary shaped by his concern, his worry about the Corinthians. His itinerary was shaped by the edification and encouragement that he wanted to bring. The last one is his itinerary was shaped by the charity that he was collecting. And we already just read in Romans 15:25 and 26 how Paul was taking up a collection as well in Macedonia and Achaia to bring to Jerusalem because they were having a famine there. And so this was also a mercy mission, you could say. And he references this many times in the book of 2 Corinthians, especially in chapters 8 and 9. If you think of the passage about how God loves a cheerful giver, that is in the context of Acts 20, Paul gathering together a collection for the saints in Jerusalem. So that's happening as well there in Acts 20. I know you just sort of gloss over it, but this is why cross references and things like that and Bible study aids are helpful. There's a lot happening in this very short, even 3-month period that Paul is going through. You can read 2 Corinthians 9, verse 1 and 2. He says, Now it is superfluous for me to write to you about the ministry for I know your readiness, of which I boast about you to the people of Macedonia, saying that Achaia, remember this is Achaia, and that's where Corinth is, this is Macedonia, Philippi, Thessalonica, saying that Achaia has been ready since last year, and your zeal has stirred up most of them. So he's saying, man, I've been talking about how generous you Corinthians are with your money, and that's getting the Macedonians, who are much poorer than the Corinthians, ready to give for the collection in Jerusalem. And so don't let everybody down, guys. Make sure that you are worthy of that boasting. You can read both chapters, but we see here Paul's heart is also in his itinerary shaped by this mission to bring relief to the church in Jerusalem. All of it, I guess you could say, packed here in these few verses, is part of Paul's expected journey, his itinerary shaped by the concerns of others, the encouragement he wanted to give to others, and the collection he was making, especially for the church in Jerusalem, which was suffering. It's a very others-centered kind of itinerary. So he was setting aside, I want to be in Jerusalem, I want to be in Rome, but for the sake of all these other churches, all these other believers, here's my plan. And for the most part, that was honored by the Lord. The rest of what happens in Acts 20, though, all the way to the end of it, is what is unexpected. Verse 3, it says, There he spent 3 months, and when a plot was made against him by the Jews, as he was about to set sail for Syria, he decided to return through Macedonia. So, again, don't think of Syria like modern-day Syria, but this was considered the Syrian, province, Roman province. So he was going to head back, sail into Tyre, and then make his down to Jerusalem. So that's what we mean by Syria. in that context. Almost casually, Luke mentions that there's a plot against Paul by the Jews, presumably to have him arrested and or killed. Maybe they got Paul off the boat on a catering truck or something. But they discovered the plot and they hurried him off to safety. I don't know if you guys know what that joke was about, but okay. Our president was taken secretly off of Air Force One on a catering truck because they discovered a plot to kill him recently. So you can read about it in the news. That was the joke. Okay, so they got Paul off, hide him away in some bin or a barrel or something, and they realized, okay, this is not safe to go this way, and so we have a unexpected detour in Paul's itinerary to go home or go back to Jerusalem. And so Paul decides to go back the way he came. That's why most of these third missionary journey maps, it kind of, it goes into Corinth and then like back out the way he came. So you just have these double overlapping lines there. So all of these do that. You can see that here, and you can see that here. And it's because of this plot to kill Paul by the Jews. And we've seen this before. We know the Jews don't like Paul, his preaching, his message about Jesus. They're upending their laws and customs, and they're stirring up trouble, and we've seen all that. We don't need to go into that. But as so often happens with unexpected changes to the plan, God usually has more opportunities in store. Everything that happens in the rest of Acts 20 is because of this plot against Paul, and what they intended for evil, God intended for good, just as we remember those words from Joseph. And first we see an unexpected ministry and an unexpected fellowship happening here at the beginning. Verse 4. Sopater, the Berean, son of Pyrrhus, accompanied him, and of the Thessalonians, Aristarchus and Secundus and Gaius of Derbe and Timothy and the Asians, Tychicus and Trophimus. These went on ahead and were waiting for us at Troas, but we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and in 5 days we came to them at Troas, where we stayed for 7 days. Now, Romans 15:19, you don't have to go there, but Romans 15:19, it mentions a ministry that Paul has in Illyricum. And I can't remember if Illyricum was on one of these maps. No, so I apologize. No, okay. Illyricum is not mentioned in the book of Acts. It is a town that it lies west of Thessalonica, and a lot of commentators point out that the only time really this could have happened, or maybe the greatest time this could have happened, is during this unexpected time of ministry that Paul had going back through the way he came on this third missionary journey. And so this ministry to Illyricum might not have happened. I'll read it for you because it's not insignificant what he says here. He says, for I will not venture to speak of anything except what Christ has accomplished through me to bring the Gentiles to obedience, by word and deed, by the power of signs and wonders, by the power of the Spirit of God, so that from Jerusalem and all the way around to Illyricum, I have fulfilled the ministry of the gospel of Christ. Thus I make it my ambition to preach the gospel. So Illyricum represents this end of the ministry or edge of the ministry in Macedonia and Achaia. So it's not a small thing. And so we see there that this is perhaps when that happened. Regardless if that's the case, the providence of God is always behind everything that happens, even the inconvenient moments, even the trials, maybe especially the tragedies. In those moments, we often question God, why me, why now? As if the reason something is happening to us is about us. But a lot of times, it isn't only about us. It's not about us, but it's not only about us. When things don't go according to my plan, your plan, I think it's helpful to think that perhaps it is going according to God's plan for someone else. Not that God isn't always trying to teach me something, but maybe the hardship we face is also about the blessing it might be for someone else. So, someone tried to kill Paul, but now other people get to be blessed. In the same vein of this unexpected ministry, you also have this unexpected fellowship opportunity. You have many men here gathered together to accompany Paul on a journey back. We wouldn't expect this. The text kind of suggests that if it were not for the decision to return through Macedonia, none of these men would have really gone with them, including Luke, which he gets picked up here. We last heard from Luke in Acts 16. Remember, he had a lot of those we and us passages, and all of a sudden, after the events of Philippi, it's they and them. And now in Acts 20, we get back to we. We went on ahead, or we sailed away from Philippi. We stayed for 7 days and so on. So I don't think Paul would have picked up Luke, probably in Philippi, if it were not for this journey back. So he had this unexpected fellowship opportunity. We won't go through all the names and do a bio. We've seen most of them already. And frankly, you can go through it yourself, check some cross-references. I know that might seem a little bit lazy, but I think the point is that these men represent Paul's missionary journeys, his gospel sharing, and the church planting that he has done. And these men represent all these major regions that he has planted churches, from Asia to Macedonia and Achaia. He has had a tremendous opportunity to impact many lives. And they're not just representatives of Paul's mission to the Gentiles, but they're also some of Paul's dearest friends and brothers and partners in the ministry. You will see these names like Trophimus come up many times in Paul's other letters, Tychicus and so on. These are men that he got to spend some extra time with, to encourage them and to train them, to speak into their lives. And I think I mentioned at VBS that I can still remember some of the men who I had as teachers, who I truly believe God used to nudge me on the path to being in ministry. It was just a week, but I remember, Wook Kim and the grace that he showed me. I don't know where he is now. I don't know if he would realize it, but just how he was as a leader and teacher of these elementary school kids, it affected me. It pointed me towards this pulpit. That's the sort of thing that happens. The pastor I had before coming to ICC, I really only knew for 2 years, I think less than 2 years. But I wouldn't be a pastor. I wouldn't even be at this church if it were not for that unexpected meeting in providence and fellowship. And of course, I've been profoundly changed by Pastor Dennis and Pastor Bob and Pastor Mike when I started out at this church in the early years that I was here. Those were all unexpected fellowships, unexpected providences and meetings. I did not plan for any one of those. From my point of view, they were completely random, incidental. But in God's eyes, they were all part of this purpose to bring me where I am today. One of the greatest treasures of this life, I think everyone could say, Christian or not, is we get to meet people. That's a precious gift. 8 billion people made in the image of God on this planet, and every one of them is reflecting some goodness and some of the glory of the image of God. Of course, it is tainted by sin, of course, but it's a gift. Even if you're not a Christian, I hope you would think of it that way. But especially as Christians, we add to that gift of getting to meet these wonderful people made in the image of God, that God has put people in our path purposely and providentially and unexpectedly. And that means ministry. It means evangelism. It means fellowship. So when your plans get sidelined, maybe it's to put you next to someone that needed an encouraging word, or that you needed to hear from them an encouraging word. Or maybe you're being sat down next to a future wife or husband. That's true too. Unexpected fellowship opportunities, some of the best moments to me, when you're just in some random place and you meet another believer, somewhere you don't expect it. And though you just met this person, you have the most important thing in common. I think a lot of you have expressed that kind of thing to me. And I love that moment. It's like we don't know each other from Adam, but we both know we love Jesus, and now we have instantly the most important thing in common, and there's fellowship there. In any case, Paul was able to spend a little bit of extra time with these men that meant so much to him in his ministry, men who would go on to impact other men, who'd go on to plant other churches and so on until here we are, 2,000 years later in Irvine, California, Irvine Community Church. Now, they missed the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is, it's the feast after Passover. So you celebrate Passover, and then you have the Feast of Unleavened Bread right after. And instead, they're in Philippi for that. This is perhaps mentioned because Pentecost happens 50 days after. That's why it's called Pentecost. And he wants to be, Paul wants to be in Jerusalem by the time of that feast. So it gives a little bit of a timetable or sense of urgency. And again, they pick up Luke here. He's not explicitly written in there except in the we part. So the we is Luke. So you can add Luke to this unexpected opportunity. Well, beyond this unexpected ministry and fellowship is an unexpected missions conference. Verse 7, on the first day of the week, they finally get to Troas. Remember, they got to sail across. It took 5 days, and apparently, if you're a nautical person, it should have only been a 2-day journey, but because it took 5 days, maybe there's some bad weather. In any case, this is a travel log. You know, this is real events, real people. Luke is recording these things happening in reality. He's not making it up. The first day of the week, when we gathered together to break bread, Paul talked with them, intending to depart on the next day, and he prolonged his speech until midnight. There were many lamps in the upper room where we were gathered, and a young man named Eutychus, sitting at the window, sank into a deep sleep as Paul talked still longer. And being overcome by sleep, he fell down from the third story and was taken up dead. But Paul went down and bent over him, and taking him in his arms, he said, "Do not be alarmed, for his life is in him." And when Paul had gone up and had broken bread and eaten, he conversed with them a long while until daybreak, and so departed. And they took the youth away alive and were not a little comforted. So again, everything is happening as a result of Paul choosing this alternate route through Asia in order to go back to Jerusalem. I think that this next section, of course, with Eutychus and even the goodbyes in Miletus to the Ephesian elders, which is one of the most tenderest passages in the New Testament, would not have happened if it were not for this plot against Paul. So those Jews, they were trying to do evil and harm. Instead, they leave us with this wonderful testimony. So to those nameless, hostile Jews, thank you. God used you to do something really wonderful and beautiful. Now, the first day here mentioned on the first day of the week, that's Sunday, which is the Lord's Day. I know you're very accustomed, at least I am, of thinking of the weekend as Saturday and Sunday. But throughout much of Western history, Sunday was the first day of the week. And it was a work day, not a holiday. The Saturday for the Jews was the day of rest. So Sunday would have been a work day. They're meeting here in the evening because they had to work that day. To break bread here on the Lord's Day is a reference to taking communion or the Lord's Supper together. And that wasn't just a cracker and juice, but they had an entire meal. 1 Corinthians 11 talks about that a little bit more. But this is a reminder that it was very early on in the church that they would gather together on the first day of the week, Sunday, to take communion and to worship together. And Paul's been there, and I imagine that this was the culmination of a week-long informal missions conference in Troas, as Paul was gathered there with all these representatives of the Gentile church gathered there in Troas. Some of these men I'm sure Paul had not seen in person in a while. So just like a shepherd's conference is a time where I meet and catch up with pastor friends I haven't seen in a while. So I think this was an opportunity. Paul had a chance to hear about the churches that these men were ministering in and what was going on. So it's like a little conference. But shepherd's conference is only 3 days long. But towards the end of it, you do start to get a little groggy during the messages. And here, it's already after a day's work. They've eaten dinner. It's midnight. Those lamps are flickering, and everyone wants to make a comment about these lamps. That Luke is saying there's a lot of lamps in this room, and it suggests that maybe the oxygen is not plentiful because you have all these lamps. It might be a little smoky in there. If there's a lot of lamps, it's indication there's probably a lot of people in there as well, and so you have a lot of CO2. Being exhaled, and there's going to be a lot of body heat. There's no AC. It's in the springtime, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's really cool. You got to imagine it's kind of muggy. And you add to that, Paul is just going on with his message. All right, he speaks a long time. There's actually the word for he prolonged his speech. The word prolonged there, it's a unique word. It's not used anywhere else in the New Testament. So it's like Luke had to reach into his vocabulary to describe Paul's talking here. I don't know. So, look, every commentator and every preacher, they just view this very comically in a way, as if it's about either falling asleep in church or long-winded pastors. I actually don't think it's about either of those, but I'll get to that in a second. In any case, you can imagine the scenario, though. You can imagine that room and how it would have felt. You can get a sense of how you might feel if you were in that situation as well. And we have Eutychus. Eutychus was a fairly common name for slaves. Ironically, his name means fortunate or lucky. He's a young man, and the word young man there in Greek can mean perhaps 8 to 14-year-old. That's just a lot younger than you're probably thinking. It's possible that this description of young may not be like a strict description of an age, like that he was like a young teenager. Maybe it's just being used as a comparative thing, that compared to everyone else there, he was like the young guy in the room. It doesn't matter. I mean, this point is going to work either way. But you have to ask yourself, what is this young man doing up so late in this room? He's not a part of Paul's cohorts, as we saw listed in the early part of Acts 20. But he is eager. He's wanting to hear and know more about what God has been doing. He wants to hear more about the church. He wants to hear more about the gospel going into the world. You know who Eutychus is? Eutychus is the next generation of ministry and missions. That's who he is. He's maybe the youngest man there. And maybe you have little kids or something like that. They're all asleep by now if they're there. This was a young man who wanted to stay up where important people were talking about important things. Things about God. Things about a risen Savior. Things about the forgiveness of sins. And he was trying his best to hang in there and glean as much as he could from these discussions that Paul was having with these brothers and pastors and missionaries. But as the warmth and the darkness and the smoke start to make him drowsy, what does he do? Because he wants to hang in there. He goes to the window because he wants to stay and hear Paul speak. He could have gone home. He could have just sat in his chair and conked out, likely with other people who had already conked out. But he wanted to soak up as much as he could. I think this is about a young man who's eager for the ministry and just fighting even his own desire to sleep. You think of the juxtaposition with Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, right? He's having the most intense moment of his life. And what are Peter, James, and John doing? They're snoozing. They can't even fight it. Spirit's willing, but the flesh is weak. You can't stay up with me for even an hour. You get the impression that they didn't even really fight it. Well, I think Eutychus here, he was fighting it with all he had. When I was in seminary, I think they cranked the AC down to like 60 degrees just to keep it cold and uncomfortable. And I would sit in the very front of the class, most classes, just right in front of the professor so that I would not have the audacity to sleep in front of their face, right? Just to keep myself awake. Kind of worked. But that's what you do when you really want to be invested in something, right? You're trying to fight, as we call it in our house, the Z monster. Don't let the Z monster get you. And I don't think it's just like, I don't think it's necessarily something. Look, hindsight, we can laugh about it. But at the time, you think about this. It wasn't funny. This would have been a tragic death of a young man who was interested in the ministry. It would be like going to Shepherd's conference, right? And a promising seminary student dying at the conference suddenly. We would not be making jokes about it. At the time that, well, I guess he got resurrected really fast, but if he had just stayed dead, you wouldn't be, it would be sad. You wouldn't be making jokes about it or anything like that. It would be sad if it happened at Shepherd's Conference. After he woke up, yeah, we'd get, make jokes about it afterwards, I guess. That would be something. But you just think for a moment there, this is like someone who is eager. His heart is in the right place. His desire is for things beyond his age. The next generation of missions and ministry, and he dies in this tragic way trying his best to stay awake. That's kind of a sad story, really, when you think about it. But in a display of God's kindness, and I think his concern for the next generation, God raises this eager young man from the dead. And it's almost no emphasis on the actual miracle. It's like young man being overcome by sleep, fell down from the third story, taken up dead, but Paul went down, bent over him, taking him in his arms, said, "Don't be alarmed, for his life is in him." Don't worry, guys. He's alive. You don't even really see the miracle. He's dead. Luke is a doctor. He knows dead. This guy was dead. It says it there. He's taken up dead. So this is not that he had just, been knocked unconscious or was severely injured. The fact that everyone just casually goes back up and has a snack after tells you that, and they don't take him to the doctor or anything. Like, he would have been severely hurt at the least, falling from a third-story floor. So this is a miracle. Not that this doesn't count as like an authenticating sign of Paul's apostleship, the signs and miracles that the apostles do. But I don't know if that's really the focus, because again, everything is so casual here. Paul has a late night snack. It says that he broke bread and ate. This is likely not the same as having communion, but let's say a 2 a.m. snack, bowl of cereal or something. And then he keeps on talking until daybreak. He conversed with them a long while until daybreak, and then he left. Now, yes, in hindsight, again, maybe you could joke about it afterwards. But certainly the point, I don't think, is about falling asleep in church or preachers that preach too long. That is not the point here. I can't tell you how many commentaries and pastors just make a big deal about that. And there's jokes galore. You can make them all day long. I get it, about both people sleeping in the pews and pastors preaching too long. J. Vernon McGee has a bunch of funny jokes. You just listen to him if you want to hear the jokes. He's got good ones. But I think the point is, someone dying and rising again does not stop the mission and the ministry here that Paul had. This is a whole unexpected thing, right, that's happening. This whole thing's unexpected, that he's there. You don't expect people to die when you're teaching and sharing. He wasn't just preaching, by the way. It's the words that are used to describe him talking there. Some of it is discussion, too. So this wasn't strictly speaking a sermon, a long sermon session anyway. But if Eutychus dying or falling out of a window is not enough to distract or derail the little missions conference that Paul is that is happening there and that Paul is having there, I think it tells you something about the ministry and the mission of the gospel. And in fact, I think it tells you something about Eutychus too, that he was so eager to stay awake to hear it that he didn't realize it. He'd give up his life for it. He didn't realize that was going to happen. That was unexpected for him. That wasn't on his itinerary that day. But he was so willing to hear. Just think about it. If a window has no, strong backing on it, and you're sleepy, do you go sit on that window? Probably not. So something was more compelling than the common sense to do that, right? So I do think this is more about the ministry and the mission of the gospel, even for Eutychus, and that he was that next generation. And God in his kindness preserved his life because God is preserving the next generation of missions and ministry, always. We see his grace and mercy and kindness and healing power, of course, in the story. And we should give God glory for that. But I think what we ought to do is commend him for his desire to be there. Maybe that's more of the message for us. If you're going to make any kind of contemporary application, maybe it isn't about how long the pastor's sermon is or falling asleep in church. It's just how eager are you to be here? How eager are you for the mission of Jesus Christ and his gospel? How eager are you for the ministry? I've had long talks with some of you, well into the wee hours of the morning, sometimes in a car, sometimes at Denny's, sometimes here, sometimes in a home. Those are such beautiful, important moments that I'm sure you've had with others. Why was I so willing to stay awake that late to talk with someone? Because of the ministry, because of the mission. And there's times when I've been tired. There's times when my eyes are barely keeping open in those conversations. But it was important. Those moments are important. It was important for you to kiss. It should be important for you, for everyone here. So important, God did not want even death to stop it in this occasion. Well, maybe that's more the lesson. The power and need of that kind of Christian community and ministry that we are willing to spend those hours invested in. Maybe it's saying something about our willingness to stay up late or do what it takes to see the gospel passed on to the next generation. I think that's what the story's more about than about long sermons and about sleepy parishioners. Well, the last thing we're going to see, and we're not going to get to today, of course, but is the rest of the chapter, is going to be an unexpected goodbye. It's going to be very sweet and tender. I've actually preached on it before, but it's a really beautiful passage. Might take maybe one or two sermons, but we'll get through that. But if you are a Christian this morning, I hope you can see just the blessing that there is in Paul's itinerary and the blessing that there is when there's unexpected turns and twists in your itinerary, and that you can see God working through you in them. If you're not a Christian this morning, I hope it's been communicated to you just how important this was to the people that are here in this text. And I hope that you are seeing in the lives of the Christians here and around you that same kind of urgency and desire. If you are not a Christian, I want to ask you what you think is more is worth dying for. Like Eutychus here, dying for the sake of hearing about the ministry and the mission of the gospel. What do you think is worth dying for? There are few things truly worth your life. God has given you this one life to seek that one thing, or those few things. One of them is a life submitted to the Lord in pursuit of his honor and glory. All other glory, all other honor fades away. This is a mission that's gone on 2,000 years of glory, of suffering and trial, but it has gone on for 2,000 years. There's not many organizations that can claim something like that. It's because we have found the thing worth our lives, worth pursuing with our whole life. If you're not a Christian, what are you living for? Is it for yourself? Is it for the glory of others? Is it for temporary gain and pleasure? The Bible says all of that is empty, vain pursuits, sin, and only leads to destruction. The only path of life is to turn away from those sins and those fruitless pursuits and to follow Christ. He laid down his life for us, died for our sins, and rose again from the dead. That's the mission here that was worth dying for. Would you consider that? Would you look at your life and be honest about it? What is it for? If you have any questions about what the gospel is, please talk to me, talk to anyone else that was on the stage. We'd love to tell you.